It's 9 o'clock. We stand for I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call. Brian Bickel.
Urken.
Pothier.
Mary Martinson.
Levoy, Hurley.
Chris Cole.
Barbara Tellman.
And we get no indication that John is called.
Nobody's called in.
Okay. And Jeff Rogers is also absent.
Jeff has declined. He's got too many court dates this morning.
Okay. Call to the public. Peter, do you want to say anything?
Just want to introduce myself. I'm Pete Tyson. I've monitored ballot prep quite a few years, cycles, and signature verification occasionally, so I just thought I'd come see what's going on here.
Hopefully you won't consider your time wasted.
Always interesting.
Chairman's report. Listening to the radio on the way down this morning, North Carolina continues to be a never-ending fiasco. I think the lesson learned out of that is it's against a lot of harvest ballots there too. It doesn't keep it from happening. Funny that. And they tend to be a little bit more devious about the way they do it, or that's what it appears. And obviously enforcement of the law tends to be problematic, so.
They just don't turn them in so they don't get caught.
Yeah.
We just need to do like California did, legalize the whole damn thing.
Well, I mean, we just made it illegal last year.
Yeah. California made it very legal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the one guy must have had a very big family because they said he turned in 775 ballots. So, to say that this has been an interesting year, I think is an understatement. And should provide for some meaningful topics of conversation through the coming year as to what we can and can't do to address some of the concerns that we may or may not have. So, post-general election, Brad?
I provided everyone with the numbers that I received from Brad. That's in your packet. When he went back to 2010 to show a trend.
John?
Good morning, folks. This is John Cote.
Okay. It's the time to listen right now, John.
All right, I'm just calling in.
Right, gotcha, thank you. Go ahead, Mary.
He wanted you guys to have the trend from 2010 to 2018 on early ballots versus poll ballots.
It looks like we've had about a 5% bump in early ballots
Yes.
from 75-25 to 80-20.
Yeah.
And going back to 2010, that looks like that may be a trend.
Yes. And a drop in poll ballots.
Right. Although,
Well, I wouldn't say that because the poll ballot thing is up and down.
Yeah, it's up and down,
it's
and,
up and down, midterm,
yeah, but
non-midterm.
with the growth every cycle in the eligible voters, and the ballots cast being up and down, yeah, I wouldn't want to try and make sense of that.
Do we have any report yet on provisional ballots, how many were accepted? That comes from the recorder's office. We did get a report from them by precinct of how many ballots were accepted and the ones that weren't accepted, why. I think that's of interest to the group.
Yeah.
You
Sure.
know,
Yeah.
do you know if we turned anybody over to the county attorney this year?
I have not heard.
The number that sticks in my mind for the provisional ballots were 18,300 was what was accepted.
I was made aware of something this morning. I guess Danny White had sent Brad, and I'm not sure if anybody else in the office, an issue. He noticed that in precinct 32, there were 10 blank ballots, excuse me, at the precinct that were counted as part of the final tally. He indicated that, at least to me, that that was an unusually high number, and he was curious if you guys have noted that and if you've been able to research it at all.
I have not heard of
Okay.
that.
As somebody who was there quite a bit of the time observing the counting of the ballots, I'd say that things went almost perfectly. Very few minor hitches, but nothing at all to get excited about. Election night, there were 2 precincts where the poll workers had problems, and those were resolved the next day by some work. Basically, I think everything went very smoothly.
I'll agree.
I did have another issue at precinct 32, it happens to be mine. Is it possible that you guys could share with us the exact instructions that are sent out to the poll workers in terms of, here are the type of ballots that these are the type of ballots for these various areas? Precinct 32 has changed over the years. It used to be all of precinct 32 was in Amphi, 31 was in Flowing Wells. Those got combined along with, I think, 155 or 152 or something 2 or 4 years ago. I forget exactly when. But now both school districts are in precinct 32, and both that larger precinct now is roughly a 50-50 split between county and city. And so that situation from 10 years ago, popping up again with these larger precincts. What are the specific instructions when you've got these multiple jurisdiction precincts in a general or even a primary where you've potentially got so many different types of ballots? What is the specific instruction to poll workers for that specific location that says, okay, you open the boxes today, you better find X number of ballots? In the case, I went to vote, and at first they told me, well, you're supposed to get this type of ballot, you're in Flowing Wells. It's like, no, I'm in Amphi. And so they, after back and forth, they gave me a provisional ballot for Amphi, but then they determined that since the Amphi district election had been canceled, there were only 2 candidates that came forward for that particular election. I didn't need to vote the provisional, so that was thrown out, and I went back and voted the traditional. The problem I had was, okay, what was the instruction to the poll workers that morning, either in writing or whatever, that said, here's how many you're supposed to have?
They get a ballot report with the number of ballots for each color stripe they get.
Right.
They also are told to look at the signature roster next to your name, which will tell them what color ballot to give you. I have also provided to the inspector and the special situations clerk a list of the color and exactly what that color means. If you get a no color, a non-stripe, a white ballot, that means that they live in the city of Tucson and Tucson Unified School District.
Okay.
So we give them the information.
I guess my question is, what, in the situation, we knew, at least I knew, that the Flowing Wells election had effectively been canceled and would not appear on the ballot. The Amphi district election, according to the poll workers, should have been on the ballot. Well, obviously it wasn't. It had been canceled too. What kind of instructions are given to those poll workers for things like that? Because it's not just school districts, it's fire districts, it's those other smaller jurisdictions that may or may not be anticipated for the general election. Are the poll workers instructed that, for this particular general election, this election was canceled, therefore if someone asks about it?
We don't tell them which elections are canceled because they can barely handle what elections are on the ballot. That's why we tried to tell them to use the color.
And you know that the elections have been canceled before the ballots were printed.
Yeah. Because they don't care on that.
Has there ever been an election that's been canceled after the ballot's been printed? I agree, shouldn't be, but
Situation where that occurred.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've had instances where a candidate has died after the ballots have been printed, but the election wasn't canceled.
Right.
They still showed up on the ballot, and I believe there's instances where they've actually been elected.
Oh, yeah, number one.
So, yeah, once you're on the ballot, you're on the ballot. You don't disappear. Okay.
I learned something new this time. I was looking for the new precincts. We had, back in February, March, we had a list of proposed new precincts, and I was looking for new ones in the reports. And the answer that I got from Brad was that there was only one new precinct that they finally approved. It was in Vale, and all the other ones that were circulated as proposed were not accepted. So we now have 249 instead of 248 precincts.
And one that has nobody in it.
Yeah. And one that has hardly anybody in it.
Can you explain why we have precinct 27 again? Brad did once. And
The Independent Redistricting Commission split Mount Lemon for whatever reason, and I can't remember if it's a legislative or congressional district that splits it,
It's a legislative district.
but because it runs through Mount Lemon, we can't cross a precinct over that. So we had to create a precinct with 0 voters. And
it drives the Secretary of State's office nuts.
Well, they have it all over the state. They have national forest, national park.
Mine road is split.
Well, you people should be congratulated for really good, careful work. Just always impressed every time you observe. What a good job you guys do.
very much.
Yeah, I think from a tabulation perspective, you know, I don't know how you communicate this to the general population, but, you know, one of the letters to the editor post-election was, you know, if we just counted the urban ballots ahead of time. Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
And don't release the results. No, we don't. You know, their suggestion is how to fix the problem is exactly what happens. And they don't understand why the problem is still there. I can tell you, I was scheduled to be down there to watch tabulation a couple of days where Barbara sent me an email and said, we don't have anything to count. Don't bother coming in. So, you know, from a mechanical perspective, we have no problems. I mean, in fact, the first time I was down doing tabulation observations, we had a problem with a ballot total. And they actually recounted the entire morning's work on one of the machines, because that's where the issue was. But essentially taking one of the counters out of service and redoing a half a day's work had no impact on, no discernible impact on when we got done counting ballots for the day. So, you know, I think the setup we have is extremely efficient. Now, if we could just teach people how to walk out to their mailbox, life would get better.
There was one situation where some people had a sleepless night where things were not adding up, and somehow in the middle of the night, one of the people realized what she'd done wrong, and it was a bookkeeping problem. They solved it, but we were there for, probably an hour and a half trying to solve the problem, and then finally decided it was better to go home and go to bed and try again tomorrow, and that worked. So they really, really do try to fix things.
Okay, any other observations post-journal? Concerns, questions? Hand count audit.
this big report here. Dave wisely does his report and puts it on our website and sends it to the Secretary of State. I am at the hand count audit. I left early this time because we had stuff we needed to do. But Barb was there, Bill was there.
I had a problem at the last minute, I couldn't make it.
So,
I was told not to be here, so.
we went the way they always go.
Wait, I'm assuming we had no significant issues.
No.
Okay. And
I have some insignificant ones.
Sitting on the VCDC, it's interesting because I get a notebook every time I go to a meeting that has all the hand count audit reports, and it's a system. I understand what they're trying to do, but they've designed the system so it never fails. I mean, if you actually had a problem with your hand count audit that made you fall outside of the acceptable guidelines that the vote count verification committee has set, we'd be in the same hot water North Carolina as as far as I'm concerned. Because it's huge. You know, it's like driving a Hot Wheels racer through a barn door and hoping you don't hit the sides. It's just, and the frustrating part for me as a member of that committee is there's PhD statisticians on that group that don't understand that. You know, to me, if you're going to use something as an audit monitoring tool, there needs to be a reasonable expectation that at least periodically somebody's going to fail. And that's not to say that the failure is catastrophic, but somebody ought to fail. If nobody ever fails, and my understanding is this has been in place since 2010, and nobody's ever failed to meet the acceptable criteria. Now, there are people that have hand count audit problems. I think the bigger concern to me from a hand count audit perspective, for as much time as we spent on RLAs and the kind of hand count audits we do, is over 50% of the counties don't do any kind of an audit because the parties don't care or don't want to participate.
Or at least one party.
Or, yeah. So, which I think if we were looking for something to make the audit process at least more of a validation tool, everybody ought to be required to play the game.
Yep.
Well, at least they have to report.
Is it appropriate? I'm having a hard time dealing with the fact that I'm sitting in a room without being able to have any eye contact, but I can sort of hear people talking. I'd like to add to this conversation whenever it's appropriate.
Okay, I'll let you know, John.
All right, thank you.
Fundamentally, we've all dealt with legislators, so we understand that their first response tends to be, it's a crisis, let's solve it, here's a Band-Aid or whatever they want to call it, and that will suffice, not understanding that when you're dealing with a process that has multiple steps, multiple places where you're supposed to not only have observers, but verification that what was received in this stack is the same as what the previous guys passed off, and making sure that that sequence occurs all along the way. Unfortunately, the folks in the legislature don't always think in those terms. It's, okay, there's a problem, let's do an audit. Well, fine. What happens in the case of an error that is found, what are the consequences? As far as I can tell, you go to the judge and say, if it even gets that far, the judge is basically going to say, you know, the machine count stands, you move forward. All of these laws are fine in the abstract. It's the application that usually causes the problem. And yes, human error is a huge part of it, but when you're dealing with something that is as fraught as determining who's going to have access to spending you know, in the case of federal offices, trillions of tax dollars, there is a motivation for somebody wanting to get in and potentially manipulate the result. We can either pretend that doesn't exist or deal with it and try and make sure there's as many opportunities to catch somebody that wants to have, you know, a nefarious purpose.
So are there things done even when the threshold, this big threshold that we never flunk on, are there things done even, you know, when there's differences but it doesn't meet that threshold?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, if you had to have a variance of 5, and you had a variance of 1,
Or two.
do you do anything to address that issue?
The only thing I know is if you're outside the variance, then you have to hand count more ballots.
Right.
And then if you're still out, then you have to hand count more ballots. But I don't know what happens after that.
Well, and the issue is with, and they've structured it so that they deal with polling place ballots one way and early ballots another. The variance on polling place ballots for the hand count is plus or minus 3 or 1% of the ballots counted, whichever is greater. So if you're counting 100 ballots, it's 3. Well, that means if you have a variance of 1 or 2, it's okay, whatever that means. You don't have to count more ballots because you're inside the target window. With early ballots, it's 5 or 2%, whichever is greater. And not being the brightest bulb in the chandelier, sitting here going through the hand count audit at the primary, one of the things you figure out real quick if you're participating in the tabulation process, we know what the number's supposed to be on the audits for the early ballots.
Right.
Because we pull the bags and we tell it, fine, the audit pack is 200 or 250 ballots. Well, if you're counting the ballots in the box and you got 199, you're wrong. Don't bother to ask you. Not everybody knows that because not everybody's privy to that, but you have a fixed number of ballots. So if you're pulling 200 ballots and you've got a window of 5, and the window for the primary and the window for the general are exactly the same, and they've been the same since the inception of the committee, then an error of 5 ballots is what you're going to operate with, because 2% is only 4. So, in my opinion, if you have a discrepancy of 3 or 4 votes on an early audit bag, it's okay by the standard that the legislature has set through the committee that they've appointed. But if you extrapolate that to the total number of votes cast, the election doesn't mean a damn thing.
Here's the fun part. If there is an election that is particularly close, say less than 100 ballots, and it's a race that had 100,000 or more total ballots cast in it, you can extrapolate and say, okay, 80,000 of those ballots were in the early ballots. We've got a variance of 2 or 3 based on each run of those early ballots. You extrapolate, and all of a sudden a difference of 100 votes. It's significant, but here's the fun part. The public finds out that that there's a variance of 2, 3, even 4 per stack of 200 ballots each time that it's through the machine. You want to talk about a public perception problem?
Yeah.
But it's in other contexts, I don't think this question was answered, at least as I understand it, because under some circumstances, any variance is a problem.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because if it's 1 or 2, or maybe you're missing it, it could be 4 or 5 or 6. So in very secure environments, don't tolerate any disagreement. And I don't think our election process is going to meet that standard any time.
I think it ever
So-
could. Is it
sorry?
possible? Is it possible?
Under some circumstances, I think it is, but, you know, for a large election, it's not. And I don't know if that, what you had in mind when you asked the question.
Well, yeah, that is what I had in mind, but it's not just, is it possible? It's, okay, so you have this variance, you haven't met it, and if you do something, I mean, even if you don't sort of reconcile it and find out, oh yeah, here's where the errors are, and we account for that, then it matches. Even if you don't actually get to that point, learning what the process of trying to reconcile it tells you something, and that can be used to improve things. I mean,
Just, John,
Yes, sir.
go ahead.
All right, so if Barbara's there, she'll attest to the fact that I spent a lot of time, and I'm sure Dale's there, that he'll attest that I spent a lot of time
Yeah, you were there a lot.
in the tabulation room and in the counting room where the machine is. And I urge, my first comment would be that any of us that haven't ever done this and observed an election should do this. I started off by watching a poll all day, a precinct, 2 precincts, and then the next day, the Wednesday morning, I followed that down to the ballots and the provisional and conditional ballots down to the library where they were turned over to the elections department. I observed all that. And then the next day I came in and I observed what was going on with in the recorder's office until about 7:30 that night. And I want to stress a couple of things that are not inconsistent with what I've said before, and maybe you aired this to your own satisfaction, but I didn't hear it or couldn't catch it all. If it did, put it all together. I am at a distinct disadvantage not being able to see who's talking and pick up the nuances of what's going on in the conversation. And I regret that, and I apologize for it, but bear with me. Anyway, there were 18,164 provisional ballots submitted on election night, and another 164, roughly, maybe another 200 approximately of conditional ballots. So a total of about 18,300 more or less, and that didn't include the 2 precincts that maybe Barbara spoke to that had some problems, one of which was off by 3 or 4 votes,
everybody in this commission should have been there for at least a couple of hours to see what really happens.
Now, all of that having been said, did we have a mess like we had in Maricopa? No. Different recorder's office, different process, so on and so forth. I don't know if they've even resolved that up there yet. But going back to my point, these 18,000 ballots and these that are cast as provisional ballots take time to process. The ballots that are delivered by hand at the precinct take time to process on that. And the timing is in the recorder's office. Timing is not in Brad's office. So even though they have a little door, they shove the boxes through and then begin their project. It is a long, determined process. I personally, and again, I'm not speaking for the people I represent, but I personally have a problem with the election process dragging out for 10 days. I think that's just wrong. I give the public the public's view in many cases is, well, it just gives the boys time to manipulate the process, fix the answers, whatever. And that probably isn't right, but who knows what kind of things happen with early ballots. They come in with a signature. That signature might be, like in my case, 31 years old. It's compared. And for those of you who are politically oriented, what are they comparing it to? They're comparing it to a signature that has also your designated party there. Now, they wear blue lanterns and red lanterns and black lanterns and all that over there, and so does Dale's people with bracelets, and it looks like there's an attempt to keep some division of workload there. It appears that way. But on the other hand, if your goal is to process every ballot, which is the stated case of the recorder, how many of these get tossed out, and how did we account for them in the election reconciliation? Doesn't sound like many got tossed out. So we shouldn't lose sight that this is a little bigger than what we're talking about, and what we have handled with good input from the elections department, and so on and so forth, who, by the way, I thought were extremely cooperative. For someone like myself who had never been through this before, I found them to be extremely straightforward and cooperative. No one tried to hide anything, to my knowledge. Now, maybe some would say I'm not the brightest bulb on that Christmas tree, but to my knowledge, it did not. Now, I had wished that we had a flow chart. That's one thing I had asked for sometime earlier in the summer, and I don't think we ever got around to it, because the way they handle things in Brad's department is complicated. But it is not ununderstandable, and when viewing it, you quickly understand how the process works. Now, it's a lot of people pushing paper every which way, and generally people are signing for it. And if it's a ballot that has to be redone because it was spoiled, it's checked 3 times.
John, this is
John, are you gonna come to a conclusion anytime soon?
Well, all I'm trying to say is that let's not be too comfortable in what we know. It's what we don't know that's more important.
John, you've expressed the frustration that I think every single member of this commission has ever expressed in terms of what Arizona law and procedures allow and don't allow. And we'll be discussing it here in a little bit, my little op-ed and what things might come of it. The bottom line is that some of your frustration is shared by every single member of this commission to some degree or another. The point is that there's not much the commission can do by itself. You have to work individually with the legislature to try and make the changes necessary so that some of these frustrations go away.
Well, I think we owe it to ourselves as a commission, whatever we want to call ourselves, to make some suggestions to the Board of Supervisors, because after all, we're treading into their political process. And they should have should lend some power and some support to getting this straightened out.
And I think, John,
in
in listening to your comments this morning, your frustration, to a large degree, appears to be with the recorder's office, over which the Board of Supervisors has no control.
That's what I just said.
Okay.
But they do have some say and some pull and so forth. And there are some ways that things could be tweaked and this and that. I have a problem with the notion of ballots being delivered on to the precincts on early ballots being delivered to the precincts on election day and not processed.
You're gonna have to take that up with the legislature. It's allowed under law, that's what we have to live with.
And as some of us share your frustrations, I don't share your frustrations with the recorder's office and the signature verification process. They train their people extensively. I have attended 2 of their lengthy trainings. They train them extensively on how to do it. If there's a questionable signature, they make every effort to contact the voter. And this is not the case in some other counties, but they do try to contact the voter and see if there's a reason why your signature might have changed, that sort of thing. The recorder's office does an excellent job of signature verification.
I am very happy with FN's work in verifying the signature and getting the early ballots and provisional ballots processed. But I agree with you, somebody dropping the ballot off.
Chris.
Sorry, I'm Chris.
Okay.
You know, I agree with you, somebody dropping their ballot off on election day is stupid. And I've done it.
Okay, the agenda item we're on is hand count audit, and we're as far away from hand count audit as we can be. So let's get back on track a little bit. Anything else on the hand count audit? Michael?
I was supposed to include the clear ballot also. Somebody brought up the thing that they wanted to talk about clear ballot last time.
I'm a guilty person talking about clear ballot and was just reading it. I asked Brad in passing conversation one day what he thought about clear ballot, and expletive. Deleted. He's not a big fan of clear ballot. I don't know that I'm a big fan of clear ballot either, where in the context that I brought it up in.
What is clear ballot?
Clear ballot's it's a software package.
Oh, okay, thank you.
But there are a number of states that use clear ballot to do their audits, and they do 100% audit. Basically, all you're doing is taking the data from one software package, plugging it into another software package, and you're doing what perceptually, at least to me, is 100% audit. And if the counts match, then you can be pretty comfortable in what you do. The point being, from my perspective, it's a hell of a lot faster than doing an RLA. Because the time that we spent when we did the trial RLA, we were downstairs over there for a day and a half and did a fraction of what should have been done had we been actually doing the risk limiting audit for a real election. And it's one of those cost benefit issues. How much time do you want to spend verifying something that you're relatively comfortable with anyhow? So, Bill.
I think one of the things that has become obvious to me, I don't know if it is to others, one of the things that the technology has come to show, at least to me, on my time on this commission and what I've just picked up in casual reading over the years, is that ideally given that you want a system that has the checks and balances and the ability to audit the software, the hardware, et cetera, that is the components of the system, and the people and the processes they do, ideally you wouldn't want necessarily one company that provides both the hardware and the software to do all of that in one package, because, you know, then you're back to it's the techno geeks that are sitting in a room somewhere that could potentially manipulate the results. If it's going to happen, you want multiple sets of technical geeks checking on the others' work, so to speak. I think one of the things, to your point though, is, yeah, it is a cost-benefit analysis, and one of the things that I think technology is going to bring about in the coming years is whatever the new thing is, it's going to have a bunch of bells and whistles that are very appealing. The problem is, how do you apply those bells and whistles to do the things you want to do and maintain the security, maintain those checks and balances? That's going to be the hard part, because if anything, human beings are, ooh, they like the new thing, but what are the consequences of doing it? You know, 20, 30 years ago, GEMS was the be-all and end-all, right? Well, it ain't no more.
Yeah.
You know, what we're using now, I'm sure there's plenty of people that have already figured out ways to get around all the security protocols and whatnot. And, you know, what we're dealing with today, you know, 10 or 15 years down the road will be something, you know, you wouldn't want to get within 1,000 miles of it, kind of thing. But the bottom line is, whatever these different technological things you're looking at, you need to pay attention to those other cost-benefit aspects of whatever the technology happens to be. And my genuine fear, it's part of the reason we'll get to it later, some of my genuine fears is whatever legislative changes are proposed aren't going to take that into consideration, and we're going to be right back in a worse situation than, at least perceptually, some people think we are.
Sorry. You know, I'm not very familiar with Clear Ballot. You say it's just another software program to count the ballots. Is the structure of the program, the algorithms and whatever, different enough from what ES&S or any of the others do, so that it is distinct enough to catch problems and not just be a repetition, if you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand, and I don't know the answer to your question. I mean, Clear Ballot it's kind of like, you know, somebody coming in and saying, SAP is a new software program out there that does X, Y, Z. Well, I have no idea how it functions. Clear Ballot has been represented as something that is an auditing tool, which is the only reason it's stuck in my mind. It's not a primary vote tabulation software package. It is designed as an auditing tool. How that structure is, how distinctly different it is, I have no idea. It was just something that came up in a casual conversation with Brad, where maybe it's something we ought to talk about, which we're doing. Arnie?
Well, we've had a lot of experience with their ballot. Benny White was a consultant for the state of Maryland, where they looked at all the data from the last election using Clear Ballot. And it's not just reprocessing the same data, it actually has a much more sensitive collection of data in scanning the ballots. So you start from a different starting point. So it reveals a lot of things that you wouldn't see if you just took the data that goes off the ballots the way they're scanned right now. And some states have actually tested it to actually do everything together, because it is so much more sensitive and efficient. And I think that there are a lot of objections been made about cost and other things, but when you look at the cost of litigation and other costs, it may be worth the investment. So I think it's important to understand that it's not just taking the same data and crunching it a different way. it detects different information to start with. And I think it's become, that many states have actually certified it as a piece of software that they can use instead of their conventional software.
If memory serves from the presentation, what, 3 or 4 years ago now?
Yeah.
We had that the information for them. It was especially helpful in those undervote, overvote situations where you could actually look at the images on the screen as opposed to having to pull the individual ballots out, and the committee that, you know, is determining whether or not it's an overvote, undervote kind of thing to determine voter intent, so to speak. It was a lot easier to make those determinations using that system as opposed to run everything through and then everybody's got to look at, you know, each individual ballot. You put it up on the screen, God, and everybody's watching, and
Yeah, I think my impression is it doesn't go through the tabulation process with the ballots again.
right, it's the
It
images.
uses the ballot images,
Right.
and when it encounters a problem, to go to your point, is it stops the process and brings the ballot up on the screen and asks for human input.
That's not true, I'll tell you that. That misses a basic distinction, which is that their scanning technology picks up information that is often missed by the convention.
What kind of information are you talking about?
Marks, whether an oval is filled in enough to meet the legal standard. Apparently, those things make a difference. As Bill said, it saves a lot of hassling because you can see more information about the ballot than you otherwise would.
But don't those show up on the ballot image? It is.
No, not necessarily. Because that's part of the problem they argue, is that their scanning technology is more sensitive, so it produces a different image to start with. And so some states of Florida, other states use it.
I think we're getting down to the real problem, it's this determination of intention. And this happens when the ballot doesn't go through one of our scanners. You look at it, what is the intent of the voter? Did they mean to vote twice? Did they mean to fill in a second bullet, or was it just an accidental pen drop? This is one of the times when we find variances in the hand count, is that correct, Mary? Where the machine interpreted it as an overvote, but the person looking at it says, oh no, this was an accidental pin drop. The human intent is the whole problem, and I don't think the machine's gonna solve that.
The machine doesn't solve it, the machine can present information that makes it easier to solve.
But our state law does not clarify
I agree.
what is human intent.
I agree.
And neither does the procedures manual, and this is one of the things that some of us argued about in the changes in the procedures manual, that they needed to clarify how you determine human intent so that it's uniform statewide. And Mary has very clearly procedures, criteria for when you copy a ballot, that sort of thing.
But I think that misses the point, if you have more information.
No, you got the information there, what do you do with it?
No, you don't,
That's the question.
you're missing the point. Clear Ballot argues they present a different image of the ballot than is derived from conventional scanning. I mean, that's
So what do
something.
the question is, what do you do with that information? Okay, so there was a pin drop, what do you do with it?
Depends on circumstance, and the point is, there's so much information, a machine can pinpoint and identify that so that you don't have to go through all the images trying to look for it.
But once it's pinpointed, there's nothing in state law or regulation to tell
We're
you.
not talking about state law, we're talking
Yes,
about
I am.
human judgment.
I'm talking about how the state law deals with the question of human intent.
Okay.
It doesn't.
I'm the one that raised the issue of clear ballot, and I certainly did not intend, nor was I aware of the fact that there was a whole hardware package that went along with this. My concept of what I was reading about clear ballot was strictly, purely, totally, unequivocally a software package that reanalyzed ballot images,
Not true.
period.
Yeah.
That's that, and that may be a piece of clear ballot, and clear ballot may have a whole package that they put together, just like ES&S does. But I'm not advocating in any way, shape, or form that we have two different counting rooms with two different sets of machinery, that we do all of the ballots in two different ways, or that we get rid of the ES&S equipment and bring clear ballot in. This was a software package that reevaluated software ballot images that were generated by the ES&S system. That's the extent of this discussion.
That's your understanding?
No, that's the piece of it that I ask questions about.
Yeah.
I don't want to get into the hardware of clear ballot. If it's better, then the next time we're ready to buy new equipment, we can talk about clear ballot. But that's a non-starter at this point in time, in my opinion.
So we've decided somewhere along the way that we are better off working with images of ballots instead of the ballots themselves.
No,
Technology, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is not a technology used that is certified by feds that actually counts the physical ballot. All of them use the image. That's because of the technology.
But we only use the ballots if there's a problem. The images are really the data that are critical.
I just heard you say that you were looking at an image.
yes,
Right.
To look at that. So if you've got a problem, you're looking at the image, not the ballot itself.
No.
it-
If there's a problem with the image, or if there's,
Are we?
no, the actual ballots have been kind of demoted to backup.
That doesn't answer my question.
What is the question is unanswered? Why?
Well, because when we have a problem, are we using the image or the physical piece of
Well,
paper?
we use both.
It depends.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you're looking at a spoil ballot, obviously, you're
Obviously.
using
Right.
the.
But that ballot wouldn't even go through in the first
Right.
place.
And for the most part, and Barbara's a lot more familiar with this than I am, but there's a limit to how many times we'll send a ballot through the machine before we accept the fact that the machine says, I can't read this ballot for some reason. Then you're resolving the problem with a physical piece of paper. Where the image comes in is when you're running ballots through the machine and the tabulation is occurring, you're not tabulating the paper ballot. You're tabulating the image.
Understand?
Okay, so, and the point Arnie was trying to make is, clear ballots machine makes a better image than ES&S's machine does. But when you're actually dealing with a problem, you're almost always dealing with the paper ballot.
And to put a finer point on it, the Arizona law, the law itself does not actually recognize ballot images. We have an interpretation of law that basically says the ballot image will be preserved like the paper ballot is preserved at the treasurer's office.
But at some level, when the software is looking at the image, even if we don't use these words, it's trying to decide voter intent by looking at that image. And if that decision is embedded in code, and if that isn't open so that people can see how does it determine intent, then it's pretty obvious that there's some code there that will be determining intent that may do it differently than a human looking at even the same image, let alone the ballot. Okay, so human looking at the image may see the stray marks and say, they didn't intend to vote twice, it was a stray mark. And the software says, no, they voted twice, so it's an overvote and doesn't count.
But that's not what happens. If you were down there watching the tabulation, you would have seen a number of ballots that end up in the top tray, which means there's something wrong that the machine did not count that ballot. So then the human being at the scanner looks at that ballot and says, oh, I see what's wrong. There was, somebody voted twice and it looks like they intended to vote twice very clearly. Or it says, yeah, there's something here on the other bullet, we're not sure what it means, we send it back to a human being to interpret and give us a new ballot that the machine can read.
So you said that's not what happens, but all I was saying is the software is making a decision, and I think that has to be what happens. The software is making a decision. Now, the things that you're seeing that were rejected, yes, you can compare there, but there's things that aren't rejected, and there's still a decision made based upon the image, and the software is making that.
Yes.
And you never notice that.
Right, there's threshold, that sucker's got a window, and the window's adjustable in the
Right.
software code, like you're saying.
Right.
So who does the adjustments?
But the companies have standards for doing that. So when you buy the equipment, whatever system it is, they make those explicit.
And our
Machine is
system
the
will
one.
reject.
But it's not either or, I think. It's not either machines or humans, it's both.
It
in
is.
some way.
Our machine will reject fairly small images that were just stray ballots. It will tell them, this is a problem, you need to look at it.
Chris, then Bill.
If I remember correctly, when ES&S was presented to us, the image, the amount of image in the circle, filled in image in the circle, that they set the threshold at was 35%, but it is adjustable by us, by the election department, if we have to set a different standard. So if it's 35% or less of the circle, of the oval filled in, it's counted as not filled in, not voted. If it's 36 or more, it's counted as voted.
Yeah, clearly a person wouldn't do that. They would be like, oh, let's see if there's 35% of this. Right, they look at it and they go, no, they meant. And if it's sort of, some of it's darker and some of it's grayer, you know, they see it as filled in, even though the software may have said, oh, no, you know, so that's what I mean by the decision that's built into the software is, there's all of these, it's more than just a number like that. There's how dark does it have to be considered part of the filled in?
Here's another twist for you to consider. In state law, if you have a precinct scanner, when you go to vote and the machine interprets the ballot as having an overvote, someone can physically look at the ballot before it is accepted by the machine and ask the voter, did you intend to vote here twice? And let the voter revote. In the case of an absentee ballot, the voter does not get that option. It is fed through the machine. If the machine interprets that is a second vote in a race where it's not allowed, the votes in that race are rejected. So voter intent, depending upon whether you voted at the precinct with a precinct scanner or sent it in early ballot, you have an issue. You also have an issue for federal races and statewide races where one county has precinct scanners and another county doesn't have precinct scanners, and the early ballots are, you see where I'm going?
Yes, right.
We save money though, Bill.
Do you really want to go back to that argument again?
Yeah.
No,
The other part of that though, it's not the issue, I'm a big bit of a devil's advocate here. It's not the issue, the ones that get rejected, those are obvious, you let take a look, you fix those. The ones that, like you alluded to, are inside that window that get accepted because the computer decided, yeah, this voted for Doug Ducey, okay, well, this voted for that. It's the ones that are inside that window that kind of go, okay, yeah, I think I don't know.
That's why it's important to emphasize that Clear Ballot maintains that they start with more information about what's inside the oval. And they didn't invent the scanners, they use a commercial scanner that's just more sensitive. So, you know, that changes the ballgame, or at least it can. And I think it would be good if, Dale, if you would ask Benny White, or maybe you have it.
I have no contact with
I will ask him to send you a copy of the slides that he prepared for us about a year and a half ago, where he talked about the study that was done.
Yeah.
And for the whole state of Maryland. And they revealed really big differences.
The presentation that Benny did for the commission
Yeah.
is online, it's been videotaped, you can watch it.
Do we
The archive.
have access
It's
to?
in the archives,
Yeah.
yes, it's in the archives, the same one, go to the EIC
Okay.
website, all that information will be there.
How do I,
What date would it be? I have absolutely.
No, but how does he get to the website? Does he just go?
how do I find it when I'm at the website? Any idea?
It's Pima.gov, go to the commissions and you'll scroll down and you'll find the election integrity commission.
It's under his name, or is it just a?
It's just gonna be one of the.
You just
one
have to
of
do
the-
it, go back a year and look at the topics.
Go look at the videos for the past couple of years, they're in there.
Wait, so I'm looking by topic for.
No, you've got a screen that's got tabs.
Actually, it'd be
This is
better, I
2018,
can-
2017, 2016, and when you hit 2016, it'll tell you what was talked about that year by month.
That's rather tedious. I'll email Benny and ask him to send us a copy.
But to your issue, the only way to fix that problem, we quit using machines and go back to putting piles of ballots.
And you really beg a problem then.
It worked for a lot of years.
Well, I mean, if John has trouble with the election results dragging down for 10 days, we could have it drag out for 10 months.
And every time we do a head count audit, 99% of the problems are human error, that people cannot carefully count it out. Machines are much better at it, but even though they might have some slight drawbacks. But human error is the whole weak spot in the law and in the regulations. And Mary has this wonderful set of pages telling her people how to interpret human error, what to do with a ballot that is bad. As far as I know, that's the only county in Arizona that has that. And we didn't persuade the former Secretary of State, I guess the still current Secretary of State, that that sort of stuff mattered. And in fact, the reply was the other counties don't do it, so it shouldn't be in their regulations, rather than let's upgrade the regulations. So maybe the next time around we can get this and clarify.
Okay, anything else on the income audits? Moving right along, Maricopa update. Does anybody know what's going on in Maricopa County?
I don't think Maricopa knows what's going on.
One of the things, and I think it's germane particularly to the discussion that we had earlier about the interaction between and the control that we do or don't have, be it real or perceived, over the recorder's office is, there is, if your information is correct, an IGA between the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors and the Maricopa County Recorder, that basically the Board of Supervisors in Maricopa County has abdicated their responsibility for elections, washed their hands of it, and given it all to the county recorder. And they are one of 2 counties in the state that has done that. So it is the presence of that IGA fostering the relationship with the recorder's office in Maricopa County that I think also fosters the division of duties, responsibilities, and the span of control between the Elections Department Board of Supervisors and the recorder in the other 13 counties.
What's an IGA?
Intergovernmental agreement.
Basically, I can't remember if it's the 1950s or 1960s, basically Maricopa County Board of Supervisors went into an agreement with the Maricopa County Recorder that said, we're gonna, for organizational purposes, we're gonna put the Elections Department under you. Historically, what had happened was if the recorder was of one party, that recorder typically chose someone of the other party to run the elections department. But when you're all in the same house, that whole separation of powers, checks and balances thing kind of gets fudged.
So that reinforces the sense of distrust, I think, that goes on.
Well, and I think
In this
it's got to the point where there's actually discussions between the recorder and the Board of Supervisors to undo that.
On a personal note, what really ticks me off about that, they've had the opportunity twice now to rescind that IGA and they've refused to do it.
It's called EGO.
It's called stupid.
Well, I've said that all along. I said that when Helen Purcell got raked over the coals.
Have you seen a copy of that IGA?
I've not seen a copy of it. If it's anything like what we do down here, because remember, in the state of Arizona, it's school superintendents at the county level that are in charge of school elections. It's an IGA essentially between the Pima County School Superintendent and the Pima County Board of Supervisors to run the election. The school superintendent has the authority for the language and all the other stuff associated with that school board, or that school district election, be it a board, override, whatever. That is, they send the language off, it gets approved, disapproved, and comes back, and whatever they approve goes right on the ballot. And then it goes from there. I'm assuming, if memory serves, it's like a one-page IGA between the school superintendent and you guys.
It's 1 or 2.
Yeah, it's not, it's basically, here's the election, here's the date, you guys are in charge kind of thing. I would assume it's nothing more complicated than that, but it's Maricopa County, so what they do up there, God only knows.
But the reason they do what they do is because of an IGA between the Board of Supervisors and the Recorder's Office. Which is why we're so different, and a lot of the other counties are so different, is that authority hasn't been relinquished or abdicated by the Board of Supervisors.
And we're also dependent on electronics making their polls work.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Maricopa County is dependent on electronics to have their polls work and be open, and we are not, and I think that's a good thing.
Well, I think it's telling too that take the vote centers out of the mix. And we have more polling places than Maricopa County does, I
Yeah.
think.
Oh, absolutely. In the primary, we had,
That's why I said take the vote centers out of the mix. Not the 40 vote centers they have, but they have fewer precinct polling places than we do.
I don't know.
Or considering the fact that they have over 4 times as many voters as we do, they don't have 4 times as many polling places.
And I'm sorry, I know there are people that really like the idea of all mail-in voting, but as long as you have the opportunity to vote at the polls, having fewer of those locations inherently should raise a lot of questions, simply because if something goes wrong in any one of those, proportionally, by concentrating so many voters in one place, the potential to disenfranchise a whole bunch of voters. I mean, the one place they had that had been foreclosed on the day before, you get a power outage in a significant part of Maricopa County, and all of a sudden, election day becomes a lot more of a circus than 2016 and 2018 put together were.
Yes,
and we could hold an election by candlelight.
pretty much, yeah.
There's a lot.
I'm not going to say anything. I'm not gonna say anything.
And I don't know that there's a good solution to the problem. It's, you kind of look at the problem as you go along and address it where you can. I know we did an experiment here in 2012, I believe, with e-poll books,
No, that was 14.
or 14.
Yeah, and it was only in Vail. So it was
No.
7 precincts.
We had one up in the foothills.
Was that e-public or was that an iPad?
That's right, there were two different
What's the
things.
difference?
E-public has the registered voters on it. The iPad was for looking people up to see where they were supposed to vote.
Right.
Okay,
2 separate things.
Yeah.
but physically the same device?
No.
No?
Completely different.
Right. Anything else on Maricopa?
Yes, we can look at Maricopa and say, okay, now we know what not to do.
But for the grace of God. I think it is worth reminding, for the record here as well, when you're talking about something as important as an election, you've got to make sure things are as close to perfect as you can possibly get them, because if something goes wrong, it can go catastrophically wrong in terms of voter confidence, etc. I think all of us have been on here long enough to imagine quite a few scenarios that would be rather unpleasant to have to live through. It's like that old saying, the bad guys only need to get it right once. We need to get it right all the time.
Yeah.
More or less.
Most of the time.
Yeah.
Having come out of the healthcare field, there's been a lot of people died because we couldn't get it right all the time. Okay, public voter information. I believe this is you.
Well, no, we were gonna come back to revisit the idea of getting answers to some questions from the recorder's office about what data are collected and how they're managed, so that we can do our job. And I know that when John Voorhees was here, he thought that there was some possibility of handling or editing those questions to make that happen. I just don't think we should let it drop because of FAN's reluctance to answer any question. I mean, her job is to serve the public.
I don't think you're
And-
correct on that. She
I'm
answered
sorry?
a lot, she answered a lot of the questions when the two people did their tour and we got those answers.
She didn't answer a lot of the questions.
I'm saying she
Then.
did. I'm not saying she
Yeah.
answered them all. I'm saying she did answer the
Some of them.
questions that they asked
But
her
there,
to tour.
but there, she shouldn't get to pick and choose which questions she answers, because she serves us all. And I think she does an excellent job. I think that, over the years, it's clear that if there's a mistake, she jumps on it, she learns about it, she fixes it. That's admirable in an administrator. But, she's administering the system she was handed. And that's what the other questions address. What happens to those data? And I think we have an obligation, if we're doing our job, to do what Brad talks about all the time, is to make sure that the system that is operating is trustworthy. And it's not trustworthy until those other questions are answered.
I think what we decided to do was come up with a set of questions that had not yet been answered and that were not easily answerable in state law, and come up with a new set of questions.
Okay, time out. And I'll take this responsibility. No, this is not what we're talking about here. This is the thing that came up that I asked you to put on the agenda, and that was the subject you brought up about the app called Vote With Me.
About the what?
Vote With Me.
Oh,
That's what this is about.
okay.
And this is about the availability of, and I downloaded the app and played with it.
Well, actually, yeah, thanks for the correction. And actually, you had sent some information, and there were two things, actually. One was that parties in Colorado and other places were taking voter registration information and using it to build an app to do campaigning. It's the first time that had been done. And then you reported that you could do that as an individual now. There's another app that allows you to mine your contacts, to reach out, to try to persuade people to vote or to persuade people to vote.
I remember the article, it's like I said,
Yeah.
it
But
vacation.
that was what
Yeah.
you're referring to.
Yes.
And I think the reason it was interesting was that, as far as I know, it's the first time that that's been done with public information.
I think the concern that I sent was that the article I sent was, it raised a lot of concerns about the perceptions of privacy, okay? I mean, granted, this stuff is public information, but what's the unintended consequence of something like this? Do people just not register to vote? I mean,
It goes back to Bill's point about technology, that
yeah.
what's public and private is altogether different now. People can sort of do that without any legal or operational restrictions. And I think we don't have any, best of my knowledge, we don't have any standards in Pima County for saying that those things are okay to do or not. I mean, I don't think the recorder is dealing with the issue, and we've not discussed it before in this body.
It raises the age-old question about it. Just because you can do it, does that mean you should do it?
Right.
If technology has proven anything, it will occur whether we want it to or not.
Well, yes and no. I mean, in other countries, they've allowed people to opt out of those situations where things can occur to protect people's privacy. I mean, it's not a technical problem to do.
Yeah, and so you end up, you can opt out, so now I opt out, opt out by not registering it at all.
Well, you don't have to go that far. You
Well,
can
that's
simply-
one of the
That's one
potential
option.
consequences. Okay?
Yes, you're right.
You have to consider all the potential consequences. I was a system engineer and I did this kind of stuff for a living. It may be far out, but you have to consider that's still a potential consequence. The other one, if you put a box there where a person can check, say, opt out of making my information public at all. Well, that kind of screws the political parties who actually do use this stuff, have used it for various voter lists and things like this, And that takes that off the table now. So
But that may be actually a good thing.
maybe, for some people, it's a good thing. I'm not, listen, I'm not arguing one way or the other.
Yeah.
It's just careful what you ask for.
Just as a point to intersect, I know you guys get tired of hearing me drone on, but this needs to be said. I don't know who was just speaking, but he's absolutely correct. The perception that carries over from about the Arizona elections carries over to Pima County. All the bad stuff that happened up in Maricopa County, if it happened, carries over to Pima County. All the stuff that happens in other county locations where things aren't right, that carries over to Pima County. And everything that happens in Efrain and Rodriguez's office, may I remind you, it's 70% of the tally, that carries over to what Brad and his people have to do in his office. If it's a smear, it smears everybody.
Getting back to the concept of privacy, privacy is almost a non-existent thing anymore. If you use your cell phone, it tracks where you are. I went to a local restaurant, I didn't use my credit card, I didn't ask mapping where it was, and as soon as I got home, I had a message, did you like your meal yet? The privacy is gone. If you have a cell phone, if you use Google, if you use even your credit card.
It's not Big Brother, it's Big Google.
Yeah, it's,
Yeah.
it's a big private
There are,
company.
if you pay attention to what's going on in other countries, there are ways of blocking those things. So, you know, many people don't know about it, and it's not widely advertised because big vendors don't want it to be known.
You can block some of it, but even if your cell
That
phone
part
is
you
off.
can, what you just described, you
You can
can
block it.
affect, on your phone, so that.
Maybe, maybe not, it
Yeah,
doesn't
but the
test.
concept of privacy has totally changed from what it used to be, and all the kind of information is available, the kind of information they got from Facebook for the Trump campaign was just absolutely amazing.
But the question is not whether it should, it's whether it's being used without consent.
It's
and
always
what
being
can be
used
done
without
about it?
consent.
And I think part of it goes back to the statement you made. Other countries, this country is not. And I don't know that we have the ability at this level to restrict, provide the option, or make it available. Which is where you get to the point, Levoy, where you take the ultimate step and you just don't register to vote or register to do anything.
But for historical accuracy, this commission about 4 years ago, was it? The county and the university investigated the idea of setting up information profiles for each voter that would determine essentially privacy restrictions. What could be shared, with whom, how it could be audited, and actually create a market for that information, which would change the whole dynamics of the way information flows in principle. I see you shaking your head.
I just, you know, we put the stuff online, and people, every time you turn around, you hear about somebody's database being hacked and that kind of stuff. So I'm not putting my profile out there online for anybody to look at. I'm sorry.
I'm not suggesting that.
Mentally.
I'm not suggesting, but some people may want to share, not the whole file, but certain information. I mean, I think that it's outrageous that we share the history of participation the way we do now. That's sold. I mean, using it for public purposes is one thing. Most people aren't aware that it's sold multiple times without their permission, without any perceived benefit for them.
Here's the thing though, back to your point about, here in Pima County, yes, this commission is, we advise the board of supervisors, that's our sole role. But there is that other side to this commission's mission that talks about public perception. And if we're not paying attention to these kind of things, it's going to bite collectively all of us in very uncomfortable places. I think though, back to the point about this information in Pima County, it would be nice, and I think we need to renew the request, to have Chris come over and just give us a briefing on, here's the highlights of how that data is handled, and we can then see how that data intersects with these other issues that we're dealing with.
Not
We
only
should
how
know.
it's handled, but what does the state law tell
Exactly.
them to do about how to handle it? How much of it is optional at the recorder's level and how much is in state law?
Can we renew the request to have Chris come and have a chat with us?
You can, I'll bring it to Brad's attention.
I think they, I think the chair of the commission is supposed to do that.
Yeah, I can do that.
Maybe we pick a March date as well and give him 3 options. Or what's your calendar say, Chris?
Okay, anything else on public voter information? But the vote with me up there, which I was kind of excited about, because unlike you, I don't mind sharing anything.
That's not true, Brian.
Once you run for office, all bets are off.
What's your social security number?
X-2787.
Just lie like other politicians.
Exactly.
For the perception of what comes out of the Vote With Me app that's out there is the only thing, it isn't an access to everybody's data, it's an access to the people that you have in your contact list.
That's the
So if you've got 3 people in your contact list, you're gonna find out information on 3 people, not the whole country. So, but then again, if you have 15,000 people in your contact list, you're gonna find out information on 15,000.
Yeah,
And if you've only got
how long would it take me to write a little piece of software to put a whole bunch of people that I don't know in my contact list so that I could do that?
Yeah.
Not long.
You don't even have to do that, just don't block the robocalls, and all of that information gets populated into your contact list.
Yeah, those calls from Coolidge and Sierra Vista, you get all the time.
No, there is, much to I think everybody's dismay, not a perfect solution to the problem.
It's not a question of perfect, it's a question of better.
Better than
Yeah,
one.
that's it.
Something would be better.
And better is defined by whom?
Stop using logic, it doesn't work.
And I think the kind of the important issue on kind of the public perception thing is that, you know, we're willing to spend time and energy to think about the consequences of these things. So, people might stop registering because they start seeing, gee, how come I'm getting all these calls and emails? And they finally find out it's because of this public record thing, and that, gee, if I just unregistered, then that would cure it, right? So if we look ahead and think about the consequences, maybe we can, at the very least, get the right communication in place. So
Yes.
Well-
It's nice to think of the consequences, and we should think of as many consequences as we can, but we're always gonna miss some.
yeah,
Well, in going back to primitive days, for those of you who are old enough to remember, there used to be this thing called a phone book. And they literally started at A and went to Z and called everybody in the damn phone book.
Yep.
The only way to beat that system was don't have a phone. And there were people that did that.
Or don't be listed in the phone book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's even ways to get a hold of unlisted numbers. But people that want data bad enough will find a way to get it.
Well, we know that from you, that we ask you for your full social security number.
All we
Gotta
usually
now
need
figure out the
to,
other 5 digits.
all we usually need is the last 4 digits to get into something.
Yeah.
Just get
That's
it.
true.
I give that to
Yeah,
everybody.
switch Brian Bickel.
Okay, anything else on Maricopa or public voter information that's worth it work? Ballot counting op-ed.
Speaking of something different.
No, and now for something completely different.
Yes. The intent of the op-ed was to spark a conversation, and it seems to have done that.
Check.
Not every day that Chuck deigns to mention you in person and write a whole memo about it, but suffice it to say, I think the bottom line for why I did it, it has served its purposes. the folks I've spoken to in the legislature seem genuinely interested in actually making some progress. I've also, a companion to this, those that don't know, I actually have forwarded to the incoming Secretary of State, the Governor's Office, the majority and minority leaders in the Senate and House, a proposal to appoint a bipartisan commission, basically consists of someone from the Governor's Office, somebody from the Secretary of State's office. You get the members of the majority and the minority in both houses of the legislature to appoint someone, bring some folks in from, say, Maricopa County, Pima County, and then 2 or 3 of the smaller counties, just to get a good cross-section of people that understand what goes on in election laws in the state of Arizona and the procedures that come about from them, and then basically have the commission sit down and come up with some ideas to change both the laws so that they can deal with the technology issues that keep coming up in this commission, some of the inconsistencies between federal law and state law, because every time I dive into the procedures manual and there's a discrepancy between Arizona law and federal law, it's basically, okay, well, we're following federal law, but it's kind of humana from the state's law standpoint about how they actually accomplish that. And then the procedures manual, that's how we got these federal-only ballots.
2014 version?
Yeah, whichever. I've been up for those meetings too, and it's just like, oh Lord. I would dearly love, and I think every member of this commission has heard me drone on about some of my problems with it, but I think for the first time in a long time there is a sense, at least amongst the legislators from the great state of Maricopa, to actually do something beyond just make some cosmetic changes. I have no idea if this will actually make any kind of progress. It has sparked a conversation, and I'm happy to talk about any of the ideas that were in there and anything related to it. The bottom line, unless there's some effort from the incoming Secretary of State and or the Governor, I don't expect much, but we've been here before and we'll be here again, I'm sure.
I found the article very informative, which is where I learned about the IGA.
Happy to help.
But in his response to you, I also found it interesting that he's very much aware of the lack of performance on the part of the Secretary of State in the updating of the elections.
Well, you know, speaking of that, I was just curious when the Secretary of State was put in charge of emergency voting centers, but then I'm not Chuck Herbert and I don't know these things. Best of my knowledge, it's in state law and the procedures manual interprets it. That you can have emergency voting centers, but then it's up to the recorders in terms of where and how many.
But is it up to them as to when?
The when is dictated in law. I believe it's, Friday before, and then through Monday at 7 p.m. or something like that for the emergency voting. It's the quantity and the locations that basically is up to the county recorder to determine.
And I think that's part of the problem with the whole process is
Agreed.
there are things that are left up to the recorder, but in that same vein, there are things that are defined in the statute that
Agreed.
people may assume are the responsibility of the recorder or within the purview of the recorder, but they are just not that piece of it.
One of the things that I have suggested in proposing this commission was at least have some guidelines that basically, going into it, number one, standardize federal and state law so that they're consistent. That's number one. Number two, make sure that the existing laws are consistent across all 15 counties, because as we saw with the whole interpreting voter intent and the curing the signatures after election day for those early ballots that, you know, after such and such a date. Maricopa started curing those. Pima had historically always cured them. The other 13 counties, if they got around to it, fine, but for the most part, they didn't do it. Again, uniformity of application of the law.
Even getting into the signature ballot verification, that's not standard either.
Exactly, I mean, all of these things, you know, both the Constitution and Arizona state law basically leave elections in the hands of county election officials, which is fine, but when you're talking about something that overlaps those county lines, all of a sudden, you got some federal court rulings and federal law that are gonna intervene, and then you got state law that's gonna intervene, and you know, if I was going to a judge, I wouldn't know what to tell the judge, you know, you follow this law, you follow that law. Does this county recorder get to interpret versus what that one does? That's not a very fair thing. I've also suggested that in my proposed commission that they keep in mind that these ideas of checks and balances and separation of powers be consistent. You know, if the intent in the Constitution was to place that power at the county level, fine, but make sure that there is some kind of oversight at the Secretary of State's level that says, okay, County X, I get that you're doing it that way, but you've got to be consistent with what the other 14 counties are doing for that same purpose for these kind of elections, or we're going to have a problem with you. Right now, under state law, correct me if I'm wrong, the Secretary of State is the repository of the information from the counties, but there's no enforcement in terms of the Secretary of State saying to County X, you screwed up.
If the procedures manual were
I
updated,
agree.
it could include a lot of that.
Yeah.
This is also a question on Bill. I mean, a lot of the counties just don't have the money to spend on elections, so they're very happy to get by with what they can.
Uh-huh.
There are also things in state law that need to be changed, like how you deal with lever machines and what you do with ballot stubs. There are quite a few things that need to be.
There's some points,
Right.
why are you gonna take those things out?
I've had some people, suggest that there actually be something in state law that forms a state commission similar to what we do here in Pima County in terms of periodically updating both the Secretary of State and the legislature on issues related to both the law, the procedures, and these other technology issues. I know when Michelle was down here, 3 years ago now, whenever it was.
Yeah, she was gonna change everything.
Well, but she at least seemed interested in having something like us at the state level, but for various reasons it didn't go anywhere. But I think from my perspective, it would make a hell of a lot of sense.
Sure.
And actually, get Arizona to a point where we're not making national headlines because our elections drag out forever.
Yeah.
Question about the Maricopa had those emergency things, but we had some.
We had emergency voting centers.
Were those called emergency voting
Yes,
things
Yes.
here?
yeah, because you can't vote after midnight Friday before election.
You can't put your early ballot in the mail and have it received by the recorder in time to be
Right.
counted
Okay.
on election day. So under state law, and this goes back to the days of absentee as well, you had the ability to show up because you were not physically going to be present on election day in order to vote.
Right.
So they set up emergency voting procedures. They're perfectly straightforward. The problem is you've got the application of the law, You got a big county like Maricopa, you put one emergency voting center, if you're not, within 20 miles of it, you're gonna be SOL pretty much.
Well, and the other issue that comes up is what constitutes an emergency.
Exactly.
And basically, the consensus of opinion is, if you, the voter, say it's an emergency, I'm
It's
not
an
gonna
emergency.
argue with you.
Well, I guess because my wife and I were poll voters, and we were not going to be here on the election day. In fact, same thing, 2 years ago, we were going gone. Figured we'd just go down to Broadway, and we'd go down there to before and vote down at Broadway, the office, and that kind of thing. I guess by Thursday or something like that, before we left, the chief comes up and says, "Hey, we got a voting sign down there by the library, Kirkbear Canyon." I was like, "What?" So drove down there.
Would somebody please explain to me with some lack of specificity how we managed as a republic to survive as long as we did when people just showed up and voted on one day, and that was called election day, and we had paper ballots, and it was really an extraordinary and unusual thing
You don't want to go there.
to have to vote early or to
John, you'll have to take that up with the legislature. They have exchanged convenience for the right thing to do.
And I can give you some history. The first time we got early ballots in Arizona was after World War I, when soldiers were abroad somewhere else and they were denied the right to vote because they couldn't show up at the polling place. And the early ballot was invented after that time.
Well, that's yes.
Well, I would agree with you, that's a reason why you should have an early ballot. But when you have an election, a primary election at that, which 70-some-odd% of your people are voting by mail, and the only verification of them is a signature, and not the signature and the license, driver's license or whatever other approved item is available. I think you're questioning the long-term viability of the elections. I think that is an integrity issue.
Bill's
The
right, that's
average
the norm
person
of the
on the street
legislature.
doesn't understand what's going on. Maybe they don't care, I don't know. But at some point, somebody will come to task on this.
It's up to the legislature to change that, not us.
I agree. I don't disagree.
Well, John, we only go all the way back when many states held their elections by voice vote. So there was no problem with counting ballots.
We can
There
get
was
all
no
6
secret
million
ballot
members in Ripley.
All right.
Well, my point is we survived through all of that, and we seem to be on a road to health and happiness by accommodating every little last niche and cranny, and one problem is solved and one problem is created.
That's,
And
That's life.
that's like,
that's swept aside.
every problem we fix brings another problem to the fore.
At least one
Thank you.
of
It
us.
usually brings 3 or 4 problems.
Human nature.
A lot of jobs for systems engineers.
Can we move on to the
Good
next
job,
item?
I just want to close with this. If you have the ability to get in touch with either the governor's office or the incoming Secretary of State, I'll be happy to share I'll send it to Dale, my proposal for the bipartisan commission. Would welcome the opportunity to discuss it with anybody. Every person I've talked to about it, regardless of what political party, they seem to like the idea, especially people that have dived into the waters of where election law is and isn't.
There's actually water
The
there?
cold is like diving into Lake Powell. You come up wondering why you ever even wanted to think about getting in there. But yes, we should circulate that around with some of the other people that are interested in this sort of thing and get a consensus, or try to get a consensus.
So that's for a future agenda item?
No, we missed,
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that, where that belongs.
oh, yeah.
Okay,
Not done.
okay. Representing the commission in public.
Yeah, I just want to point out that people should have known better because they're involved in writing the rules, violated the rules.
And he's referring to the op-ed that was in the paper that I wrote, kind of, sort of. But I didn't think I was opining on anything, didn't see it as a problem, but I'll certainly err on the cautious side in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's just common courtesy, because people may think we agree with you or disagree with you. So, we.
Yeah, we do both of those things.
Yeah.
Both those things.
With Arnie especially, but
And I don't understand who's speaking.
Arnie.
Yeah, the issue is whether, and it's an old issue, whether members of the commission who talk about elections in public have an obligation to make it clear that they speak for themselves personally, not on behalf of the commission, regardless of their role in the commission.
Whenever
And the women, just so that I understand it, just not to be too damn argumentative here, but that is so that we don't embarrass the county commissioners on this? Is that
No, it has nothing to do with the county commission. Oh, with
The
this
board of
line.
supervisors?
Yeah,
they need to be embarrassed as much as possible. No, whenever I'm talking about an election issue, I will bring up the fact that I'm on this commission and therefore I have access to information, but I always point out I'm not speaking for the commission.
Well, I think that's all fine and dandy, But I would like to point out that I would like to see at some point we have a discussion about naming the name of this commission, changing it slightly to talk about, to remove ourselves from assuming some integrity over where 80% of the votes get tabulated before they get into the other side of the equation.
You have to take that up with the Board of Supervisors, John. You have to take that up with the Board of Supervisors. We don't have the authority to change our name.
Discuss it ourselves and see what our own thoughts are on it.
Okay,
Come to a proposal if we can and get on with it.
put that on as a
It
future
needs to
agenda.
be open and out there. You can't tell somebody that you're part of the Pima County Election Integrity Commission without them presuming you're in charge of the whole damn integrity
that's
of
not
the
true, John.
election. And you're not.
That's not true. I tell people all the time, I'm a retired Army officer, and they make no assumption that I'm a retired Army officer.
You're just in the wrong service, that's all I can say.
Yeah, no.
Well, look, I have people that I know all over this country, and they want to know what in the hell's wrong with Arizona's election system.
Oh.
And they're referring to Maricopa County and all the drag out of how long it takes to count the votes and all that sort of thing. The fact that we take 10 days after election day to count the vote dilutes the value of the vote on election day.
I'd say we do it very rapidly compared to a lot of states in this country.
I'm not arguing that.
And the vast majority of the vote is
We
counted.
do it right, and we do try to do the best we can. But I'm saying to you, just the mere fact that election day, member blank, and we don't get done until 10 or so days later.
I think we should slow down, John.
Hey, John, I just spent a month in Florida. Nobody down there talked about Arizona.
Well, for whoever that is, I was
It's Levoy.
That's Levoy.
down there, and you're absolutely correct.
And you've
But
just,
years ago that I was in Florida, they didn't have the hanging chads and all the problems down there they've had since. But yes, we don't want to be Florida.
We're
Actually,
getting
the
to
problems-
future agenda items. What do you want discussed as a future agenda item?
A discussion of, well, I think we should have a discussion about, as we talked about the bipartisan blah, blah, blah. But I think as an agenda item, we should have and maybe it's not at this next meeting, but sometime into the spring when we're not, after all the other issues. I think we have an election coming up and we're still not done with the election. And maybe schedule it on into the March meeting or so, when things are a little less busy.
okay, bring it up in February.
Bring it up next meeting.
Move to adjourn?
No,
No, next meeting dates.
Ah, sorry.
put March 15th on there as well.
March 15th?
It's just, it's not a leap year, so it's the same date as February. Future agenda items?
Do we want to put the prospective legislative changes back on the agenda?
Yes, the thing you do.
And voodoo that you do so well.
Thanks! I suppose.
I think we should invite the new Secretary of State to come down and meet with us at some point, probably after she's had a little while to get used to the new office.
And I'll send a letter to her.
That would be nice, but why don't we do that after we know what we'd like for her to participate in getting done?
That's what I'm saying, wait till she gets used to the new office and
Sending her an invitation is not something that you do the day before.
I would agree. Been there, done that, know that problem. But sending it now before we're in agreement on what we would like to have draft, the commission to come to an agreement on.
John,
that's never
John?
gonna happen.
if you're living under the delusion that we're going to come to an agreement that we'd like to have her address, you're living under a delusion.
I would rather have her come down here and tell her what she's going to do.
I've used my credit card, but what can I say? Look, delusions are wonderful things. They used to be called illusions, but we no longer have illusions. We have delusions. That's
Okay.
what the world we live in.
John, time out. Do you have any future agenda items?
But I I,
Do you have any future agenda items, particularly for January?
I'm sorry, repeat the last question.
Do you have any future agenda items for the January meeting?
No.
Thank you. Anybody else have any future agenda items for the January meeting? If some come up, please get a hold of Michael. He'll let me and Barbara know and we'll put them on the
Can
agenda.
you inquire from Brad where that flow chart that he was gonna make for us? Sure. Been several months in the making.
That'd be nice to see a pro flow chart. That would be nice.
Yeah.
Anything else? Arnie?
Other things are slowing down.
Move to adjourn?
Move second.
Second?
Objections? We stand adjourned.
Thank you.